Welcome back. I'm Sherman Rivers, and we're talking about seeing the patterns. Why? Because there are moments in life that seem insignificant. Things like a missed workout, a late night, an argument that lasted a little longer than it should have, an afternoon where you found yourself distracted again. And by themselves, these moments rarely concern us because we tell ourselves it was just one day, just one mistake, just one exception. And sometimes that's true. But here's a question I want you to consider. What if it isn't an exception? What if it's a pattern? And when you think about it, that question changes everything because a single event tells you very little. A repeated event tells you a whole story. Imagine looking at your window one morning and you're seeing a single leaf on your lawn. You probably wouldn't think much about it. Now, imagine waking up every morning for 2 weeks and finding dozens of leaves scattered across your yard. Then eventually you stop asking why there's a leaf on the ground and you start asking where they're coming from. That's what pattern recognition looks like. That's what pattern recognition does. It shifts your attention from isolated moments to underlying causes. Most people spend their lives reacting to individual events. They respond to today's frustration, tomorrow's distraction, next week's disappointment. Each problem feels separate from the last, but very often they aren't separate at all. They're connected by something quietly operating beneath the surface, a pattern. And patterns have this remarkable way of hiding in plain sight, not because they're invisible, but because they're familiar. The first time something happens, it captures your attention, but the 10th time, it barely registers. We become accustomed to our own routines. We normalize our own reactions. We stop questioning behaviors simply because we've repeated them long enough. That's one of the greatest dangers of unconscious living. The familiar begins masquerading as the inevitable. We tell ourselves, that's just how I am, or that's just how life works, or I've always done it this way. But what if those aren't permanent truths? What if they're just simply repeated patterns that you've never paused long enough to examine? In the last video yesterday, we talked about awareness. We learned that meaningful change begins by seeing our lives honestly. So today we're taking the next step because awareness helps you notice individual moments. Pattern recognition helps you understand what those moments mean. And that's an entirely different level of understanding. I mean, think about your own life for a moment. Is there a frustration that seems to return again and again? Or a distraction that always appears at the same time of day? Or a conversation that consistently leaves you emotionally exhausted? How about a promise to yourself that somehow keeps being postponed? Now, individually, each one feels like an isolated incident. Together, they may be telling you something profoundly important. The Sherman River System, or SRS, isn't interested in helping manage isolated events. It's designed to help you understand the systems that keep producing them. Because once you begin recognizing patterns, you stop asking, what did this or why did this happen today? And you begin asking, why does this keep happening? And that single shift in perspective may be one of the most valuable questions that you ever learn to ask, because isolated moments explain very little Meanwhile, patterns reveal the architecture of your life. And once you can see the architecture, you finally know where meaningful change begins. Here's the real painful part. One of the easiest mistakes we make is believing that every problem in our lives is unique. Something goes wrong at work, we deal with it. A relationship becomes strained, we try to repair it. We lose focus, we promise ourselves we'll do better tomorrow. Each situation feels separate, independent, temporary. But what if they aren't? What if the frustration you're feeling today isn't really about today at all? What if today's frustration is simply the latest expression of a pattern that's been quietly shaping your life for years? That's an uncomfortable possibility because it means the problem isn't always the event. Sometimes the event is simply the evidence. Think about weeds growing through the cracks in the sidewalk. You can pull the weeds, and for a little while, the sidewalk looks clean again. But if you never address the conditions that allow them to grow, then they return again and again and again. Most of us approach our lives the same way. We deal with the symptoms. We rarely investigate the causes. We react to what happened today instead of asking what has been happening repeatedly. And then that keeps us trapped in cycles that we don't even recognize. Now, have you ever found yourself saying, this always happens to me? Maybe you've experienced the same kind of conflict in different relationships. Maybe every attempt to become more organized fades after a few weeks. Maybe every Monday begins with determination and every Friday ends with frustration. And those aren't random events. They're clues. Patterns leave clues long before they produce consequences. The problem is that familiarity makes those clues difficult to see. Imagine walking into your home every day. If a picture frame hangs slightly crooked for a week, you'll probably notice it. Leave it there for 6 months. Eventually, your brain stops seeing it altogether. Visitors notice it immediately. You don't. Not because you're careless, it's because you've adapted. Human beings are remarkably good at adapting. Sometimes it's a strength. Sometimes it's a liability. We adapt so completely that we stop questioning the very things that are shaping our lives. Constant distraction begins to feel normal. Unnecessary stress feels unavoidable. Unhealthy routines become familiar. Eventually, we stop seeing them as patterns at all. We simply call them life. But familiar is not always, or it's not the same as healthy. And normal is not always intentional. That's why awareness alone isn't enough. In a previous lesson, it taught us to notice. This lesson teaches us to connect the dots because one distracted afternoon tells you almost nothing. 10 distracted afternoons begin to tell a story. One difficult conversation may simply be a bad day. The same difficult conversation appearing in every relationship deserves your attention. One missed opportunity could be unfortunate timing, but repeatedly missing the same kind of opportunity suggests something deeper is happening. Patterns reveal what isolated moments conceal, and that's why they matter. Not because they tell you who you are, but because they reveal what your current system keeps protecting. And systems always produce what they're designed or allowed to produce. And that realization changes the questions we ask. Why did I lose focus today? We begin asking, when do I usually lose focus? Instead of asking, why did I react that way? We begin asking, what situations consistently produce this reaction? Instead of asking, why can't I seem to stay consistent? We begin asking, what patterns keep interrupting my consistency? Those are entirely different questions. They're no longer focused on isolated failure, they're focused on recurring realities. And recurring realities are where meaningful change begins. Now, the purpose of this talk or lesson isn't to make you suspicious of every habit or overly analytical about every decision. It's much simpler than that. It's to help you become someone who notices repetition, because repetition reveals patterns. Patterns reveal systems, and systems reveal the direction your life is quietly moving, even when you haven't consciously chosen it. That's why yesterday's decisions become today's patterns, and today's patterns become tomorrow's life. We need to expand on this to really see what's happening. If awareness is the ability to notice what's happening, pattern recognition is the ability to understand why it keeps happening. And that distinction may seem small, but it isn't. It's the difference between reading a single sentence and understanding the entire story. Imagine someone walking into a theater halfway through a movie. They see a dramatic scene, say someone's crying or someone walks away. The audience is silent. Without everything that came before, it's almost impossible to understand what they're seeing. Life works much the same way. An isolated moment rarely explains itself. It only becomes meaningful when viewed in the context of everything surrounding it. Patterns provide that context. They transform disconnected moments into understandable narratives. And this is one reason I believe so many people misdiagnose their own lives. They judge themselves based on individual moments instead of recurring realities. One bad decision becomes, I'm irresponsible. One emotional reaction becomes, I'm just an angry person. One failed attempt becomes, I never finish anything. And those conclusions are almost always premature. One moment tells you very little about your character. Patterns tell you far more about your current system. That word's important, system. There's an important difference between character and your system. Character describes who you're becoming. A system describes what you're repeatedly practicing. Those aren't the same thing. And that's hopeful because systems can be redesigned. One of the greatest mistakes we make is confusing repeated behavior with permanent identity. We tell ourselves, that's just who I am. But is it? Or is it simply what you've practiced often enough that it now feels automatic? Think about learning to drive. At first, every movement required your complete attention. You're checking your mirrors, you're using your turn signals, you're watching your speed, you're judging distance. It felt awkward because nothing was yet a pattern. Eventually, repetition transformed deliberate actions into unconscious habits. Driving became natural, not because you changed as a person, but because you repeated practice created a reliable pattern. The same principle shapes nearly every area of our lives. Our thinking develops patterns. Our conversations develop patterns. Our relationships develop patterns. Our response to stress develop patterns. Even the stories we tell ourselves become patterns. The encouraging news is that patterns are learned, and what is learned can be relearned. That's why the Sherman River System, or SRS, places such a strong emphasis on observation before intervention. We cannot intelligently redesign something you don't yet understand. Imagine trying to improve a piece of music by listening to only one note. It would be impossible. Music isn't created by isolated notes, it's created by patterns, rhythm, repetition, progression, harmony. Life works the same way. The meaning isn't found in one moment, it's found in the relationships between moments. That's what pattern recognition teaches us to see. Not isolated successes, not isolated failures, but the rhythm of our lives. And rhythms are incredibly revealing. They show us where our attention naturally flows. They reveal what repeatedly interrupts our progress. They expose assumptions we've stopped questioning simply because we've repeated them for so long. Perhaps that's why pattern recognition feels so transformative. It doesn't merely answer the question, what happened? It answers a much deeper question, what keeps happening? And once you begin asking that question consistently, your perspective changes. You stop living from event to event. You begin seeing your life as an interconnected system. You realize that today's decision didn't appear from nowhere. It was influenced by yesterday's thinking. Yesterday's thinking was influenced by last week's habits. Those habits were reinforced by repeated choices. Those choices gradually became patterns. And those patterns quietly became the architecture of your life. That's why lasting change rarely begins with dramatic action. It begins with accurate observation, because the better you understand your patterns, the better you understand yourself. And the better you understand yourself, the wiser your next decision becomes. That is the quiet power of pattern recognition. It doesn't simply explain the past, it gives you a clearer path into the future. So, how do we put this into practice in the most effective way possible? One of the reasons people become discouraged with personal growth is that they try to change everything at once. A new morning routine, a new workout plan, a new diet, a new calendar, a new mindset, a new life. The enthusiasm is genuine. The problem is their approach. When you attempt to change everything simultaneously, you often lose sight of the one thing that matters the most. What pattern are you actually trying to change? And that's the question that this lesson or conversation wants you to begin asking. Not what should I improve, but what keeps repeating. And those are very different questions. The first invites you to collect more goals. The second one invites you to develop greater understanding. Imagine reviewing your bank statement and noticing a single unexpected charge. At first, you probably wouldn't think much about it. Mistakes happen. Perhaps it was a forgotten subscription or a simple error. But imagine seeing that same charge appear every month. And eventually, you stop looking at the transaction itself and you begin looking for the source. That's what pattern recognition teaches us to do. Repeated frustration is like that recurring charge. Repeated distraction, repeated procrastination, repeated conflict. Each one is evidence that something deeper is quietly producing the same result. Now, the goal isn't to become preoccupied with the symptom. The goal is to understand the system creating it. Once you understand the source, the pattern begins to make sense. And when the pattern makes sense, meaningful change finally becomes possible. So, what does that look like in everyday life? Start with the observation. For the next several days, resist the urge to immediately solve every problem you notice. Instead, become an investigator. Pay attention to repetition. Notice when the energy is highest. Notice when it consistently disappears. Notice what kind of work naturally holds your attention. Notice what kind of work almost always leads to distraction. Observe your conversations. Are there certain topics that leave you encouraged? Are there certain conversations that repeatedly leave you mentally exhausted? Observe your environment. Do you think more clearly in certain places? Do particular spaces invite focus while others quietly invite distractions? Observe your emotions. When do you become impatient? When do you become discouraged? When do you become defensive? Don't treat those moments as isolated emotional experience. Ask yourself, have I felt this before? If the answer is yes, you're probably looking at a pattern. Now, this exercise requires patience. Patterns rarely reveal themselves in dramatic moments. They reveal themselves through quiet consistency. And that's why I encourage you not to rush the process. You don't need a notebook full of observations. You need one honest pattern. Just one. One recurring habit, one recurring distraction, one recurring emotional response, one recurring decision, one recurring excuse. Because one clearly identified pattern is more valuable than 100 vague intentions. Once you can name the pattern, you can begin understanding it. Once you understand it, you can begin questioning it. And once you begin questioning it, you create the possibility of changing it. And that's how intentional living grows. Not through endless self improvement projects, but through increasing self understanding. Today's daily focus exercise reflects on that philosophy. Identify one pattern that has repeated in your life recently. Don't try to fix it. Don't justify it. Don't criticize it. Simply name it. Give it your attention. Because patterns lose much of their unconscious power the moment they become conscious. That's why understanding always comes before improvement. And it's not because understanding is the goal, it's because understanding is the foundation upon which every meaningful improvement is built. If the previous lesson taught you to notice your life, then this lesson teaches you to recognize its rhythm. And once you begin recognizing the rhythm, you'll discover that your future is rarely determined by isolated moments. It's shaped by the patterns that you practice every single day. Now, let's reflect on this because I think it's very important. There's a tendency in personal development to celebrate dramatic moments, the breakthrough, the decision, the life-changing realization. Those moments are memorable, but they are not what usually changes a life. Patterns do. A single decision may inspire you. A repeated decision shapes you. And that's an important distinction because it shifts our attention away from isolated moments and toward a direction our lives are actually moving in. Think about a river. If you stand beside it a few minutes, the water looks different every moment. No two waves are exactly alike. No two ripples move in precisely the same way. Yet, despite those constant changes, the river always flows in the same direction. Our lives are remarkably similar. Every day feels different. Some days are productive, others are frustrating. Some mornings begin with clarity, others begin with distraction. If we focus only on individual moments, life can seem unpredictable. But when we step back far enough, patterns begin to emerge. And patterns almost always reveal direction. That's why I believe pattern recognition is one of the most hopeful skills that we can develop, because direction can change. If your current patterns have quietly been leading you somewhere you never intended to go, recognizing them is not a reason for discouragement. It's actually the beginning of freedom. You cannot choose a new direction until you know the one you're already traveling. That is exactly what this lesson has been preparing you to see. Yesterday we learned to become aware. Today we learned to recognize recurring patterns. Tomorrow we'll begin asking an equally important question: which of those patterns actually deserve our attention? Because not every pattern should continue. Some deserve to be strengthened, others deserve to end. But before you can make that decision, you have to see them. And that's the invitation of this lesson: not to become obsessed with analyzing yourself, not to keep score of every mistake, but to just simply become honest enough to recognize the rhythms that are quietly shaping your life. So before you move on, take a few quiet moments for yourself today and ask, what keeps happening? Not what happened yesterday, not what happened once. What keeps happening? The answer to that question may reveal more about the future you're creating than any goal that you've ever written down. Because yesterday's decisions become today's patterns. Today's patterns become tomorrow's life. Choose to notice them, choose to understand them, and only then choose which ones deserve to become part of the person that you're intentionally becoming. Now, before we finish this video or this lesson, pause for just a moment and consider these questions. What is one pattern that has quietly repeated itself over the past few weeks? Where does that pattern usually begin? And what circumstances seem to trigger it? What result does it consistently produce? Now, don't try to change that pattern today. Just simply become familiar with it, because understanding always comes before improvement. Let's continue the journey that awareness taught us to see. Pattern recognition teaches us to understand. Together, they form the foundation of intentional living. The SRS isn't built around isolated techniques or motivational moments. It's built around learning to recognize the systems that quietly shape your everyday life. As you continue through the daily focus journey, each lesson will build upon this foundation. You learn how to direct your attention with greater purpose, create clarity where confusion once existed, simplify what has become unnecessarily complex, and build the kind of consistency that transforms intentions into a way of life. So for now, don't rush ahead. Spend a few days observing. Notice what repeats. Notice what keeps returning. Notice what your life has been trying to teach you through repetition. Because a single moment reveals an event. A repeated moment reveals a pattern. And once you can recognize the pattern, you've taken another meaningful step toward intentionality. Check out the link in the description and the comments to gain access to the SRS system. It's free. There's lessons there. There's a community, a brand new community there, but it's completely free. So check that out and let it help you through your journey.